Hi guys, welcome back. Now, up till now, we have had a solid understanding about what PED is. We discussed its formula, the relevant elasticities, the diagrams, how do we draw the slopes and how steep and flat the demand curves would be. So if we've covered the basic infrastructure regarding PED. Now, another question that often strikes students' mind is that okay, fine, you've taught us what elastic and elastic demand is, what is perfectly inelastic, you taught us what PD means, that it sort of represents how sensitive consumers are to price changes. We have seen sometimes when prices go up, I mean, it causes a drastic decline in it causes a drastic decline in demand, the quantity demanded, while sometimes even a major decline in prices causes little to no change in quantity demanded. So this question strikes students at times: what actually determines that whether the demand would be inelastic or elastic? And for that, economists have come up with certain factors that we're going to be discussing in today's video. And these factors would decide on the basis of which, we can say that demand would be elastic or inelastic. Also remember, guys, that elasticity isn't really permanent. So if your product has an inelastic demand right now, it could have an elastic demand tomorrow, or for any other reason that could make it more elastic or inelastic. What I'm trying to say is that elasticity could increase or decrease, right? And Alex also, so if the let's say if your let's say if we say that elasticity increases, like PED increases, it means that a good becomes more elastic. And if I say that a PED decreases, it means that good gets less elastic, or let's say towards being more inelastic, right? So don't think that elasticity would always be permanent, and whatever elasticity you have right now, it's always going to be that way. It's not that. So for instance, let's say the first factor that we can look at it is, in fact, this is the major and the most important factor that affects, price elasticity of demand, is the availability of substitutes. So, this is the most important determinant of PED. So if you have many close substitute, guys, if you have many close substitute, and I want you to write things down as I speak, sort of pause the video and make sure that sort of make your notes. So if you have many substitutes, and let's say you have not only many substitutes, but they're very close as well. Close substitute means that whether you're consuming A, so let's say if I say A and B, good A, good B. If A and B are close substitutes, it means that both are giving the same or equal satisfaction. So irrespective whether you consume A or you consume B, it's the same. Just like Pepsi and Coke, right? So they're very, very close substitutes. So firstly, the more substitutes you have and the more closer they are, write this down. The more substitutes you have and the more closer they are, consumers can easily switch when the price of one substitute or the one good rises. So demand is elastic in that case, right? So the more substitutes you have and the more closer they are, the more the quantity demanded would contract given a rise in price, because consumers in that case would be very sensitive. They can easily switch to substitutes because they're very close as well. But if you have few substitutes or no substitutes at all, consumers really don't have any real alternatives to go to, even if the price rises. So they're forced to consume the same quantity or almost the same quantity of the same product, or close to the original quantity. So even if the price of a good rises, consumers won't really reduce the quantity demanded by a lot. Um, you know, uh, or they will be less responsive or less sensitive to the price rise, meaning that demand is inelastic or PD is less than 1. Now, I've already told you that while you're explaining what elastic or inelastic is, you can't really say that quantity demanded falls by a lot or by less or by more when explaining demand elasticities. I mean, this is for your own understanding, but if you're explaining elastic demand, you should be very technical in terms of what you're writing, because we don't reward marks when you say that elastic demand means that quantity demanded responds a lot. No, quantity demanded responds proportionately more. In inelastic demand, it responds proportionately less to a price change. Anyways, coming back, the more substitutes you have, the more closer they are, the more elastic the demand, the less substitutes you have, the less closer they are, the more inelastic the demand, right? So for example, if the price of Coca-Cola rises, let's say the price of Coca-Cola rises, so people can switch to Pepsi very easily, right? So Coca-Cola would witness a very large drop in its sales and in fact its quantity being demanded, because a lot of the people will switch to Pepsi. So demand for Coca-Cola is elastic, and so is the demand for Pepsi as well. If Pepsi does the same would happen to Pepsi. But let's say if the price of, some things, let's say a good that doesn't really have a lot of substitutes, right? Let's say let's talk about, in the example that you were giving about, or let's say certain medicine. So let's say insulin, right? Insulin. So if the price of insulin rises, people still have to buy it. So there are no substitutes to insulin. So demand is inelastic. In fact, demand is perfectly inelastic for insulin, right? So demand would be perfectly inelastic for life-saving drugs. So substitutes matters a lot. See, so guys, and substitutes could be in products as well. Substitutes could be in brands as well, right? Insulin is a product, while Pepsi and Coke are brands under the product drinks, right? So substitutes could be in brands as well and in products as well. But right? So the more substitutes you have, the more elastic the demand is. The less substitutes you have, the less elastic the demand is. And the simple reason is that when price goes up, consumers can easily switch to alternatives. If you have many substitutes, so in that case, demand would be elastic. But if you don't have any substitutes or you have less substitutes, don't just say you don't have any substitutes, just say if you have less substitutes, less to no substitutes, demand would be inelastic because consumers don't really have any other alternatives, or they have very few alternatives. So if you don't have any other alternative, then demand would be perfectly inelastic. But if you have other alternatives but fewer other alternatives, then demand would be more inelastic. Another thing that you need to know is another determinant that determines elasticity is the nature of the good. So basically, this point number 2, you can write this down. We're talking about the nature of the good, right? We're talking about the nature of the good. So if the good is a necessity versus a luxury. So when the good is a necessity or a luxury, that affects elasticities. And what are necessities in economics? Already discussed. We discussed this in the previous videos that necessities are basically those goods that people need to survive on. So demand in that case would be usually inelastic for necessities, while for luxuries are goods that people satisfy wants from, so they can actually delay buying them or they can avoid buying them. So demand would be more elastic. So for necessities, you can say that the PED would be less than 1. Here the PED for luxuries would be greater than 1. So let's say, and any example of necessity what you can think of right now. So let's say bread is a necessity, so demand is inelastic for bread. But let's say a holiday abroad is a luxury, so demand for a holiday abroad would be elastic. So let's say if let's say, in last year you traveled, let's say 3 times a year abroad to a certain place because it was, but now let's say the prices have doubled, so probably you might travel only once because obviously it's expensive, right? And it's a luxury. You know that there's no point traveling thrice because the prices have gone up, so you can sort of avoid traveling, and it's not something that you need to do to survive, right? So maybe reducing the amount of times you're traveling. So holiday abroad is a luxury, so demand is elastic. The third thing, and I want you to focus here, proportion of income being spent. Proportion of income being spent. Proportion of income being spent means that if let's say I have $100 a month is my income, then how much percentage, and if I spend $70 on something, so 70% of my income is going on something. That's a huge proportion of income being spent somewhere. So what this means is that those goods that take up a very small proportion of income, they tend to have an inelastic demand. And I want you to write this down. Number one I said was that those goods that take up a small proportion of income tend to have an inelastic demand, because in that case, if the price goes up, that won't affect your budget as much. So let's say if your monthly income is $100, and let's say you used to buy something for, let's say, $1, and so $1 out of $100 doesn't really looks a lot, right? And if the price of this goes up from $100 to $2, it doesn't still looks a lot. So you won't really stop buying it. So in that case, the demand would be inelastic, right? But those goods that take up a large proportion of your income would tend to have an elastic demand, because consumers are more careful when prices would rise or change. So let's say salt. Let's say salt, or salt, or let's say matches, like those match boxes that we have to light up stoves. So salt and matches are very cheap. They're like so cheap, right? Anyone can buy it. So salt or matches are so cheap that they take up a very, very insignificant amount of your income, proportion of your income, right? So demand for them would be inelastic why demand would be inelastic, and one of the reasons that we can justify the demand for salt and matches that used to light up stoves to be inelastic is because they take up a very small proportion of your income, so a price change don't really affect budgets much, while goods like cars or rent or house of a rent, I mean accommodation rent, or let's say smartphones are expensive, so demand would be elastic. And because car would take up a large proportion of your income, so if the price goes up or down, you would be more sensitive to price change. And that is why we usually see that when car companies usually reduce prices, they witness increasing quantity demanded and higher sales, because people just rush to buy them and book them, because we all people know that cars are expensive and they take up a huge proportion of our income, so even a small reduction in price means a lot. So that is why consumers are more sensitive and responsive to price changes, especially for those goods that take up a large proportion of our incomes. And it's vice versa. I mean, if price goes up, then consumers would delay buying it or reduce the amount of quantity or the number of times they buy it or how much they buy it. So demand would be more inelastic in that sense. The fourth factor that we need to consider is the time period under consideration. And in economics, guys, remember, I repeat, in economics, you have two type of time periods: the short run and the long run. For now, you can so let's say the short run, and you can consider short run as something being, you know, um, for now, at least for this video, and the short run meaning that in the short period of time. Although short run doesn't really mean the short period of time, it has another technical meaning to it, and we will look at this meaning when we will be studying the chapter of firms in your economics IGCSE. But for now, you can just look at short run being, you know, a short term period. Let's say for now, only for this video that would work, but it has a more appropriate definition, which doesn't needs to be given right now. When the time comes, then. But coming back, short run, what we're saying is that in the short run, demand is usually inelastic because consumers need time to adjust their behavior. So imagine you going to a doctor for some time, and he's like the best doctor in the whole country, and there aren't really many doctors like him. So if he increases his charges, I mean, you would still be continuing to going to him, although you will be looking at other doctors, but you still wouldn't really want to go to other places because you're already adjusted to him. So it takes time for it will mentally first it will take time for you to figure out that actually I need to switch my doctor because he's now very expensive, let's say. So, and in the short run, guys, you won't also find so many easily substitutes available. I mean, you won't really. Firstly, you will have difficulty in adjusting to new people or new goods in that sense, and you will also not find new goods in that sense. It will take you time. So that is why we say that in the short run, demand is usually inelastic because consumers need time to adjust their behavior, and then they need time to you know switch to substitutes. And at times in the short run, I want you to write this down, that you don't really have a lot of substitutes available as well, or let's say you don't really have a lot of good substitutes or close substitutes available. But in the long run, demand becomes more elastic because consumers can find substitutes and they can even change their habits, right? They have enough time to now they've mentally adjusted to the fact that they need to sort of switch, and even they will find good or close substitutes, so they'll switch easily. So if the price goes up, so in the long run, the demand for the product will become more elastic and consumers will become more responsive to price changes in the long run, because now they can find substitutes very easily, and they can also easily change their habits and switch to different substitutes when price goes up. So that is something that you need to know. So what we're saying is that in the short run, demand is inelastic, PD is less than one. In the long run, PD is more than one. It means it is elastic. For example, let's say petrol demand is inelastic in the short run because people still need to travel. But let's say if prices of petrol keep on rising and people are considering switching, then in the long run, demand will become more elastic in the long run, because now we see that people are switching to public transport, and people are switching to EVs, like electric cars, right? Or probably some might just move closer to their work or start living closer to an apartment or a house which is closer to their workplace, right? So in the long run, the demand becomes more in the long run the demand becomes more elastic because people sort of, if they can't find substitutes, just look at alternative ways, maybe just getting close, accommodating themselves close to their work, because now they've accepted that they need to do something and change their behavior and just not travel by car because petrol is expensive. So might just go and live near our workplace and use bike, motorcycle, or just cycling instead. Simple. So this is something that you need to know. Question. So the fifth point that we are looking at is the definition of the market. Here the definition of the market means that how are we looking at the market? Are we looking at the narrower definition of the market or the broader definition of the market? See, narrower definition of the market means that, so let's say if I say food. Now, food is a necessity, and food is a broad word because under food you have a lot of things. Even ice cream is food, right? Or drinks are food as well, or burgers are food as well, or fries are food as well. So food itself as a necessity for survival has an inelastic demand. So that is a broad definition of food. So the broader the market definition, the more inelastic the demand is. But if I narrow it down, let's say I say, oh, you know what, ice cream. Now, ice cream has an elastic demand because you have so many different brands like Magnum, Walls, Ben and Jerry's, and you have so many different sort of brands. So, premium brands and less premium brands, and Cornetto and Walls. And so, what you're saying is that the narrower the definition of a good or the market for that good, the more elastic the demand, and the broader the definition, the more inelastic the demand. So let's say if we talk about food, so food in general has an inelastic demand based on the fact that it is a necessity, but ice cream has a more elastic demand, and Magnum ice cream will have an even more elastic demand because right next to Magnum you will have different other, maybe Cornetto, or I don't know, Ben and Jerry's or whatever. So right. So the more narrow you get, see, food broad. We go down a bit, we narrow food a bit, we get ice cream. We further narrow ice cream, we get a brand, we reach a brand. Now, brand itself, it will have a more elastic demand. You have a direct competitor next to it, right? Because for Magnum, you have other substitutes like Cornetto as well, or even in different brands, right? So demand, oh, got it. This is what we are trying to say. Also, guys, it also depends that if the good is habit forming or addictive. So goods that are addictive or habit forming, they tend to have an inelastic demand because consumers just keep on buying them even when price goes up because they're addictive. They're addicted to it, like alcohol or drugs and cigarettes, right? You can give this example: alcohol, cigarettes. They have an inelastic demand because they're habit forming, right? And they are addictive. And the economic term is habit forming and addictive, right? So but in the law, uh so but usually, in the long run, even for goods that you have addictive demand or habit forming, in the long run the demand tends to become more elastic, even for them, slightly more elastic, especially when you have, we now have more things like, nicotine patches, and some smoking alternatives like vaping, which itself is harmful as well, but like, it is an alternative to a relatively healthier alternative to smoking, but still it is not something that I'm encouraging. But what I'm trying to say to you is, I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. So in the long run, even for goods that are habit forming and addictive, it's not that the demand will always remain highly inelastic. In the long run, it may get more relative. Instead of saying the demand will get elastic, because it will not get fully elastic, it will always be, if you can say, it will become less inelastic. You can say with that, like that makes more sense, because in the long run, things like nicotine patches and vaping alternatives would appear, so you will have some substitutes as well. Brand loyalty is another factor. Like, when consumers are loyal to a brand, demand becomes less elastic. It becomes less elastic because all consumers become less sensitive to price change and less responsive to price change. So even if brands keep on increasing prices, consumers don't really switch. So now consumers are less willing to switch to substitutes. And what firms do to build that brand loyalty is that they use advertising to build brand loyalty, and that sort of reduces the elasticity, and that makes it less elastic and more inelastic, right? And let's say Apple. I mean, people are loyal to Apple, right? And iPhone. So people loyal to Apple may still buy iPhones even if the price of iPhones keep going up, and we see that in our world, right? Also, guys, peak versus off peak demand is another factor. So let's say, so elasticity, guys, also depends on when a good is being consumed, right? What did I say? It depends on when. Write this down as I speak. That it depends on when a good is being consumed. So let's say during peak times, demand is often more inelastic. So PED is less than 1. And the reason why demand is more inelastic is because alternatives are limited. People don't really have a choice. And we see Uber and Kareem and, transport companies taking advantage of this. But during off-peak times, demand is more elastic because consumers have, more choice. So PD is greater than 1. Let's say train travel during rush hour. You're traveling by train during rush hour is, the fares are high, and even airplane fares, air travel fares, especially during winters and sort of summers are high because they're peak season. And like Uber and Kareem has a certain fare charges in the day, a certain time period, especially when you get off from work during evening, is very very high because you don't really have a lot of alternatives available at that time, so you need to use these Uber and Kareem to get back home. All right, so, and let's say traveling by train or by airplane during off peak season, or let's say off peak hours, is elastic. So, right. So this is something. So these are basically, the factors that sort of affects elasticity, or simply that determine whether your good will be elastic or inelastic. And over time it could change. So for example, if let's say I don't have a lot of substitutes, and maybe I might be sort of a monopoly, as in I might be a dominant firm in the market, so I don't have a lot of substitutes available and my demand is more inelastic. Also remember that monopolies are firms that dominate the market and they don't really have a lot of substitutes, or few to no substitutes, so the demand is inelastic. So but then over time competition might develop, and there could be good substitutes available and close substitutes available, so demand may get more elastic and less inelastic, or more elastic. So um you know so this is something that you need to and also brand loyalty firms could take advantage of this through advertising and innovation. That if let's say the good is more elastic right now, firms should ensure that they make their consumers and customers more brand loyal. And if they make it more brand loyal, they're actually reducing the elasticity, that if later on they increase prices, consumers won't really switch, so consumers will be less sensitive. So ideally, economically, in the economic sense, firms should make the customers less responsive to price rises. That is, they must make sure that in terms of the consumer behavior, they become more less sensitive and less responsive to price rises or price changes, to be precise. Got it, guys. I hope you understood the video and you enjoyed this as well. I will see you all in the next video. Until then, take care.